I'm so passionate about protest literature, and in particular the literature of the Romantics. So you'll see some of my scholarly background in the Romantic poets come out in this presentation. But what I really want to be today is just an MC. I just want to amplify the voices and songs from 200 years ago, from 50 years ago, from 40 years ago, and from recent times to talk about how people use art. So I'll be a little bit analytical, but mostly I'm just going to be playing a lot of different things. And I think you guys probably know this one. I'm going to start with this just to get us in the mood. So when was that song out? What year? 2003, 4, right around in that time period. So what was going on in our country right then? The Iraq War was starting, right? So there was the Black Eyed Peas singing a song about that moment in time. So one thing about social protest literature is it's often quite immediate. It's rooted in frustration, anger, outrage, protest in the moment in which it's happening. Okay? That movie that you saw, Hair, the movie that we watched for the first half an hour tonight, that is rooted in the moment of 1978. The Broadway musical Hair came out in 1968. The Vietnam War was over by 1978. Right? How do you think they got so many extras there in that last scene when they're all running and mobbing all over the lawn before the White House? Excuse me? Still didn't hear you, Kristen. They lifted it from where? But how did they get that many hippies back together again to do that shot, right? That many hippies came together. That's live footage from a 10th anniversary of a peace protest in 1968 that happened in 1978. So when the director of that movie, Milos Forman, wanted to stage this sort of reenactment and to get the sheer numbers of people who were outraged and protesting that war, he was able to film that. You're not going to get that many extras in a Hollywood movie, generally speaking, to capture that much of a crowd like that, right? And he's trying to show, he's from Czechoslovakia, so he knows something about what happened to the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, if you know anything about that. He's most famous for directing the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, if you've ever seen that movie. That's probably Milos Forman's most famous movie, as well as the Amadeus movie, which is about Mozart. But I love Hair, and I think he does a beautiful job of capturing the sense of one person struggling. Like, Berger is social protesting, but the machine eats him up. Right? He's so clever, and he makes that ultimate sacrifice for his friend, so his friend can have a picnic. He gives up his hair, right? The movie and the play are called Hair. That's the most important thing to him. But just so his friend can have an afternoon of freedom. And I would say probably of sexual experience, because the young man is coded as very naive. He's from a farm, and he hasn't had a chance to live his life, and he's going off to fight the war. You see all those really young faces and all those young men marching into the mouth of those machines, right? One of the themes I'm going to talk about today is man against the machine and raging against that machine. And I think the imagery there is very beautiful and sad, right? Even that little bit we looked at, you guys got to be caring about Berger, didn't you? You were laughing at him, the way he was sort of goofing on everybody all the time, right? And then just to see him get eaten up, like with just all of a sudden he loses his individuality and he becomes one of numbers of people eaten by that machine. And then this beautiful scene of them looking at all of those graves at the National Cemetery. It's really a moving end to that film. If you've heard some of those songs before, how many people have heard those songs before? Let the Sun Shine In, you've heard that one before, right? Probably Good Morning Starshine, some of those songs. But if you haven't seen that movie, now you can see the context of those songs and what they're about. At the end of the Broadway play, do you know what they did? When they let the sunshine in? Anybody know that? Peter, you know that? What did they do? They took their clothes off. That was their social protest, right? That scandalized people in New York in the 60s, right? But that was the thing. Let the sunshine in. That's what that song meant. It meant to be defiant, to not play by the rules of society that society was giving you. In the song we just listened to at the very beginning, what will.i.am says is, overseas, yeah, we got to stop terrorism, but we still got terrorists here living in the USA. The big CIA, the Bloods, and the Crips, and the KKK. Having a little fun with those names, right, and with the alphabets. But there is that sense of like, how are we starting a war someplace else to fight when we still have so much war going on in our own neighborhoods and in our own inner cities? That's what they're protesting in that song. Where is the love? Is that the first time anybody's ever sang about that? Right? For you, that's an old song. For most of you in this room, that's an old song, right? But for me, there's an even older song from the late 60s called Where is the Love? About the same thing, right? So another generation takes up that same question. Where is the love? How are we taking care of one another's universal and fundamental human rights? You heard them speak about that. I'm sorry I don't have all of these captioned, but I have placed this PowerPoint on the Moodle, so if you want to go and look at those things slower and just take it a little bit slower, you can find the lyrics for most of these songs online as well. Similar, this is a quote I took from the movie clip that we looked at. The draft is white people sending black people to fight yellow people to protect the country they stole from the red people. That is an utterly simplistic account for the military draft in the 60s, but I still like it. That's what protest is. Sometimes protest is trying to clarify and simplify and maybe oversimplify, but it's trying to make a point that people of color are being pitted against each other to defend land that in the first place was stolen from other people. Right? You might not agree with that. Protest, you might not always agree with what you're hearing about in protest, but the point of that speech, and that's the speech that the man was making in Central Park at the beginning of the clip that I showed, is just that. To make you think about that. What is the demographics of the people who are being drafted compared to the people who are not being drafted? I don't think today people would even use those kind of color terms in a social protest song, but it was a song from the 60s. All right, now in terms of just the formal things that I want to talk about today, I want to talk about these themes. I may be going a little bit fast sometimes when I talk, so please, if you have a question, raise your hand, ask me to clarify. A lot of what I'm going to be doing is just sharing clips and talking through some pieces of literature and art that exemplify some of these things. But today, I'm going to start with a sense of immediacy, the way that social protest responds to things in a way that is related. You don't want to have a social protest about taxation without representation and damn those British, right? That's not going to work today, right? It's not going to be a very interesting social protest. Although I haven't seen Hamilton yet. Maybe that's what that's about. I don't know. Anybody seen Hamilton? That might be social protest about the British. I don't know. But usually, social protest is rooted in something that's happening right now. There's a sense of urgency that you feel and that you want to convey to your audience and that your audience may be feeling as well. I'll talk about the theme of man versus machine. This is the theme that goes back to my period of study, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and the Romantics, who were some of the original rebels against this notion that human beings were just cogs in somebody else's machine. Social protest has to be international, or at least it's most successful when it is. If you are stuck in your own little tiny place, it's hard to get forces to pay attention to you, to get people to pay attention to you. Social protest is involved with public relations, with trying to move people, with trying to get people onto your side. If you're using it in accompaniment with direct nonviolent action, you want to call attention to the righteousness of your cause, right? And the injustice of what it is that you're protesting against. And so that means trying to avoid being just under the thumb of the local people. You want to reach out to as many people as possible and also to express concerns for people everywhere, not just in your own little neck of the woods. The whole lecture could be on this one. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples today. Contesting values and meanings. I would say the question, where is the love? And what does that question mean is one way that Black Eyed Peas is questioning why that song still, or why that phrase still matters in 2003 when I think it was Dionne Warwick sang it in the late 60s. Like, why are we still asking where is the love? Why haven't we solved the problems of poverty and crime and drugs and racism in our own country before we're going around trying to import freedom to the rest of the world? I think that's a key point in that song, right? So contesting values. What does it mean to be spreading freedom or spreading democracy? Right? We're fighting a war on terrorism. That song is doing that, and I'll give you some other examples later on. I think it's so important that our writers and our poets and our artists give us hope. If we just dwell in despair, we get nowhere, in my opinion. Although, as well as imagining hope, we need to think about collectivity. We need to be able to speak as we's and not as I's. All right, I'm going to give you a little clip from the best social protest movie of the last 15 years, A Bug's Life. I'm sure you're all familiar with that one. You might not have thought that was going to be in tonight's lecture, but it is. It is. Collectivity is really important. And as well as imagining a better world, part of what we need to do is really imagine, really see the world that we're in. And that's why sometimes realism itself is a force of social protest. So you kind of need both of those. You need the realist who can paint the picture of just what's going on so people know about it, and they're not just making it abstract. And then you need the poets and the singers and the people who give us hope for the future. You need both. Okay, so I'm going to play this song for you, and I bet you most of you who ever played Guitar Hero know this guitar riff, but you might not know the immediate context of this particular song, right? Do you guys know this song that I'm about to play? How many people think they know this song? Only from Guitar Hero, right? So isn't that just weird that this song that's so immediately rooted in the deaths of 4 college students who were protesting the Vietnam War in 1972. Neil Young and other members of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young wrote this song on an airplane ride after hearing the news of the death of those 4 protesters at Kent State. And that's what this song is about. All right, now that I played a little bit of that song, how many of you think you know that song? Just a few more, right? The rest of you haven't heard that song? Come on, raise your hand if you've heard that song. Yeah, okay, that looks better. So, but you don't know the context of it, right? Those lyrics, right, and the fact that it's about Kent State might be lost on you. How many people knew that that's what the song was about? Just a couple people in the room, right? So that's, Chingling and I, we're literature professors. One of the things that we like to do is to study literature and to study the words to make sure that people understand the historical context in which they were uttered, because the song kind of loses its meaning if it just becomes a Guitar Hero riff. I'm happy to know that you know it through Guitar Hero, but it's one of the most urgent social protest songs ever written. And what's powerful about it is that this happened, and a week later, that song was playing at college campus radios across the country. Right? That's immediacy. So as a social protest writer or singer, you often want to convey that message really quickly. Now I'm going to give you an older example from one of my favorite writers, Percy Shelley. In 1819, working class people in England were beginning to protest and assemble for the right to vote and the right to read and the right to disseminate literature in promotion of their own rights. What England did was they said, if you're going to put ever walk across campus here and somebody hands you like a flyer about some event that's coming up, right? Yes? Oh, that's happened to you? What? Okay, thank you, that's cool. So what they did was they said, well, we can't have that. If you're going to hand around a piece of paper, you're going to have to put a stamp on it, and that stamp's going to cost you what for working class people was sometimes half a week's labor, right? So, and if you're going to give them out, you're going to have to charge people that, or else you're going to have to pay for it yourself. So as working class people were beginning to organize, they were basically taxed out of their ability to organize. They called it the stamp tax. And it was an example of what was then called a knowledge tax. Just you're trying to prevent the people from organizing against you. And so in 1819, there was a big gathering of working class people, and you might see some of this in the headlines this week. What some people call an assembly or a protest is somebody else is calling it a riot. right? So that's another thing to think about, is how we define things, what words and language that we use. So these people were gathering to demand their rights to organize, their rights to vote, their rights not to have to pay these stupid taxes. And what happened was that the local authorities called out the cavalry, and they broke up the crowd with horses and sabers. The official estimate of that was that at least 6 people were killed and many, many more were hurt. But working class culture says hundreds of people were killed, and that the official story is a lie. And we'll never know, because it's kind of lost to history at this point. It was 200 years ago. But Percy Shelley, who is a British poet, was living in Italy at the time. He had left England because he thought England was too conservative and too repressive, just for some of those reasons. He and Byron took off. They went to go fight for other causes in Europe. But he begins this poem called Mask of Anarchy, which is about that event. So this happens immediately, just like for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the shooting down of those 4 kids in Kent State, the same kind of formula. He says, as I lay asleep in Italy, there came a voice from over the sea, and with great powers it forth led me to walk in the visions of poesy, which is another word for poetry, right? And he concludes this very famous poem, and these words shall then become like oppression's thundered doom, ringing through each heart and brain, heard again and again and again, right? These words, the words of the poet, right? And that's not, he wrote a whole bunch of poems in response to these events. They're called his political poems. I think I have the next one next. I don't like the way this looks. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Yeah, even if you can't read it, we're going to try it this way. Because this is what moves me, too, about social protest literature and literature in general, but really the urgency of that is that 200 years later, somebody can memorize a Shelley poem, right? Rise like lions after slumber in an vanquishable number, and be a street performer in England, still giving urgency and meaning to these words for working class people in England today.
He wrote this poem in 12 days flat. And I'll say this, it's for you, it's for ordinary people. It's in ballad form, so those of you who might be illiterate would be able to understand it. There are biblical references in it. Shelley himself is an atheist, but he knows how to get through to us. So this is his poem. Someone recently described it as the greatest poem of political protest in the English language.
That might have been
The
me.
Mask of Anarchy by Percy Bysshe Shelley. As I lay asleep in Italy, there came a voice from over the sea, and with great power it forth led me to walk in the visions of poesy. I met murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they made be an admirable plight. For 1 by 1 and 2 by 2, he tossed them human hearts to chew, which from his wide cloak he drew. Next came Fraud, and he had on, like Eldon, an ermine gown. His big tears, for he wept well, turned to millstones as they fell. And the little children who round his feet played to and fro, thinking every tear a gem, had their brains knocked out by them. Clothed with the Bible as with light, and the shadows of the night, like Sidmouth, next,
I like the guy
hypocrisy, on a crocodile rode by. And many more destructions played in this ghastly masquerade, all disguised, even to the eyes, like bishops, lawyers, peers, or spies.
All right, I'll shrink that up. I can't shrink that up again. But I love the idea that a street performer in Britain is bringing those words back to life again, just for random people that are on the mall there. And he's saying, this was the most amazing poem of social protest. It's a little hard for you guys to get the urgency. I try to give you the context of what happened there, but why Shelley was so pissed. And all those people that are being named in that, there's basically would be like naming off the people who are in the president's cabinet in our country, the foreign minister who did horrible policies to the Irish people. That's what Shelley is talking about in mentioning those people. People who participate in empire and imperialism and in the suppression of freedom all around the world. Right? The British Empire at this time was just fresh off of a military victory against Napoleon. They were very full of themselves. They were very full of pride. Part of the reasons that Byron and Shelley left is because they just couldn't stomach living in a place where the suppression of freedom and the suppression of sovereignty of individual places rather than of empires was being so celebrated as a victory for the British people. I'll say more about that later when I get to Byron. So in terms of the formal aspects of social protest, I've just shown you a song, I've shown you a movie, I've showed you some poetry. It says I better get some power. Whoops, it's going by itself here. I'll try to hit a little bit of each of these today. Poetry, fiction, song, art, photography, speech, film, your writing, right? Please take up your own pens, make your own speeches, participate. You guys having open mic again this year? This is my chance to say, do open mic at the end of this semester. Let your voice be heard. Come up here and share your words with other people in this room. Whether they be just reflective words or protest words, your choice. But your writing matters. And you never know how it's going to matter to somebody else when they hear your words. Who would think that Shelley would be being heard by some guy with a cell phone on a street, right? 200 years later, because some performer decided to try to reanimate that Shelley verse. And many times, our bodies themselves, right? These are some women in Marin who formed a group called Bearing Witness to Truth, with the pun on the word bearing. I thought their name's going to pop up here. Maybe not. This is a peace sign made out of naked bodies, filmed from above, right? So that's staged. That's not just spontaneous. That's like, we want to make a statement to people, just like they were doing in the 60s when they took off their clothes at the end of Hair to get attention, right? You think maybe people might put that on the news, that a bunch of women in Marin County said, we're going to strip down and get a peace sign out of our bodies. And you know what? They did put that on the news. It didn't stop the war, but I'm still showing it today. You're not always going to win with protest, but you're probably not going to win without it, right? So not all protest works. This is a very famous image of protest. This is somebody else putting their body in the way of an image of the machine, right? But the thing that I want to say about this, because I don't know, this was shown to us out in the West, right? Again, that international concern, because that unknown rebel his photograph was taken by a guy named Jeff Widner, who was a photographer on the roof. If that photographer isn't on the roof, this image doesn't get blasted all around the world, right? And whatever happened in terms of what that comes to mean, what the word Tiananmen Square means, the social significance of that is because people were able to protest and raise awareness of it, right? Whatever backlash that caused in China afterwards is part of the story too. So protest sometimes causes backlash, sometimes causes a rallying around what needs to be done. This theme again about man against machine, oftentimes when I do this lecture, I've done this lecture for about a decade now, I think, in various forms. I use a little bit different songs and stuff each time. But here's where I usually show that clip from the movie Hair that we just watched. Because the way that Milos Forman filmed the end of that movie with all those young men moving into the mouth of that machine is a beautiful representation of the horrors of that. But I think nobody has ever given better voice to the idea of resisting the machine than Mario Savio. How many people in the room know who he is? Who's Mario Savio? Right there. What's your name? Edgar. I love you, Edgar. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. So yes, he has a free speech area right here on campus. He taught here for a few years in the Department of Statistics. Before I was a teacher here, I never got a chance to meet him. But he's somebody who inspires me. And if you haven't heard of him, you might have heard these words because they're pretty famous. And these words are actually written on those benches over there in the corner of the green lawn that's to the in front of Stevenson Hall. There's because people loved him, they dedicated that. He died in 1996, I think. This speech is from the early 60s when he was part of a civil rights movement, and the Berkeley campus was trying to shut down the civil rights movement, and many of the students there rebelled and said, no, we're not going to leave these plazas. And this is what he had to say about it.
Being bought by some clients of the university, be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working.
Unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working, okay? Who knew? How did Mario Savio know when he was just a young man in the middle of some student protest and got up and somebody recorded that I'd be saying those words again in this auditorium, what is it, 55 years later? 60 years later. That those words would be on that bench over there. Your words might matter. That's the point. They have a way of echoing down in ways that are unpredictable, right? Because he said that with such passion and with such eloquence. He's not the first person to talk about man against the machine. That's a very common theme of social protest literature, right? We are human beings. We control this world. It's our world. It's our garden. What are we doing with this? Why are we letting abstractions like the economy, right, or nationality or some idea like that tell us how to be human with one another, right? That's the rage against the machine. And it goes way back. So I'm going to take you a little bit into my own favorite writer here in a minute, but because I will always ask you this. If you've had a class with me before, you know who the Luddites is, because I make it my personal mission that you all learn who the Luddites are, because everyone should know who they are. But do you know what it means to be a Luddite? That word itself has become kind of out of use. I don't think most people use the word Luddite. Anybody ever say, oh, you're a Luddite to somebody? What does that mean? Exactly, right. I love you too, thank you. A Luddite is somebody who doesn't like technology, right? So you got your great aunt who still doesn't have a cell phone, right? She's a Luddite. Right? That's how we use that word. That's the modern usage of the word Luddite. But the word anti-technology, again, kind of diminishes the social context of that original Luddite movement, right? Because there may be reasons why people are resisting technology that have to do with, do we really want these things that used to be done by humans to be done by machines? Are we really better for it as human beings? It seems like we have no choice. Even I bought a cell phone finally. I didn't want one at first. But you kind of feel like if you don't have a cell phone today, you're kind of not keeping up. You're not able to sort of even circulate in the world of ideas and communication that exists today. So technology has this way of speeding us up, but it's not like we even get to make individual choices about it, right? It's just something that's happening that's larger than ourselves. The original Luddites were racing against those machines. This is a cartoon picture of them. Here is an image of Ned Ludd. People aren't really sure if Ned Ludd was even a real person, right? Or if he's just a mythic character. This is a caricature of him. I don't know if I can read what that says underneath there. But here's what happened is that in England, going back again to England, in the 17th century and in the early 19th century, they created these powerful things called power looms. And these power looms could do the work of a weaver that used to take a weaver like 40 hours to do, the loom could do in 1 hour. So what happens when labor that used to take 40 hours only takes 1 is that all the weavers get together and they're like, great, we get to have a great party all the time. 39 hours a week, we get to just work on self-improvement and dance and party like they were doing in the movie Hair. Because now we can get all of our work done in just 1 hour. So it's a fabulous time for weavers throughout England, right? Right? Is that what happens? What, you don't think that's what happened? What do you think happened? They what? They increased the workload, right? They said, oh, what is your name? Jose? You're a good employee, right? You like working for the firm. How about you work the machine? You can get all the work done by yourself in 40 hours. And these other 39 weavers over here, what are we going to do with them? Fire them, right? So it doesn't work out that the weavers get to have a nice party and get to work on education and self-improvement and dance and massage and other things that might add to the quality of the human existence. Instead, in the name of profit and capital, all but one gets squeezed out and 39 get shown the high road. And actually, are you a master weaver? Have you had some experience weaving? No? Well, then we might keep you on for a low wage. But if you're a master weaver and you're expecting a high wage, we really don't want you anymore because we can pay somebody pretty cheap to just run a damn machine. You see, whereas it took a whole lifetime to gain the craft of being an apprentice and then a journeyman and then a master artisan workman with craft, with cloth in the 18th century. And you had whole generations of people for whom that work was art and craft. If you've ever heard of an arts and crafts movement, this is people trying to go back to that because they're resisting these machines still today. So in this image here, what you're seeing is that the protest is those workers broke into those looms at night with their sledgehammers and broke those machines. They smashed them. They were called frame breakers. Right? They said, no, we are not going to give over our lives to these machines. We are going to rage against those machines. We're going to smash them. Okay? Because we don't want our lives to be ruined by this stupid machine in the name of efficiency and profit. What did the government do in England? Did they say, wow, that's a good point. Let's make sure these workers are cared for, that they have job retraining, or that maybe we rethink whether we want to use these machines. Maybe they're right. Maybe the cloth is actually better when it's homespun. No, they said, if you attack one of these machines, we are going to hang you. It became a capital offense. Crime against property became a capital offense. And who spoke against it? Chingling, do you remember who spoke against it? Lord Byron. He's called Lord Byron because he's got like a title, right? So he didn't know he was going to get a title most of his life, but as it happens in England sometimes, somebody dies and all of a sudden you're Lord. You're the Baron of Nottingham, excuse me. And so he didn't make many speeches in England because he spent most of his time traveling abroad. And the House of Lords wasn't that powerful, but he was the only Lord that spoke against that bill. And it's a very famous speech. Working class people ever since 1812, when he gave this speech, have felt that Lord Byron, even though he was an aristocrat, was on their side. He was willing to speak for them. And this is what he said. He said, these machines were to the owners an advantage inasmuch as they superseded the necessity of employing a number of workmen, who were left in consequence to starve. By the adoption of one species of frame in particular, one man performed the work of many, and the superfluous laborers were thrown out of employment. The rejected workmen, and now here is Byron being ironic, the red part is ironic, he says, in the blindness of their ignorance, instead of rejoicing at these improvements in arts so beneficial to mankind, right, sarcastic, conceive themselves to be sacrificed to improvements in mechanism. The foolishness of their hearts, they imagined that the maintenance and well-being of the industrious poor were objects of greater consequence than the enrichments of a few individuals. If you've ever heard anybody in recent politics talking about the problem of wealth inequality in our country, that conversation has deep roots to the beginning of capitalism. Right? This is the beginning of capitalism, and Lord Byron is saying the same thing. Why are we not concerned about people who just want to work and live, the industrious poor, right? Instead, we're only concerned with accumulating vast amounts of wealth in the hands of a few. That's a social protest speech. Any questions about that? Sorry, I'm going back and forth between history. It's what I like to do. I like to try to make the Romantic poets matter to you guys today. They matter to me greatly. All right, I think Lord Byron and Percy Shelley in particular, and to a certain extent William Blake, but he's in a more of a visionary kind of way. He's a contemporary of those writers. Mary Wollstonecraft is a contemporary of those writers. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is one of the great feminist tracts, early feminist tracts. So there was a generation of very radical thinkers at that time. So please raise your hand if you have any questions. All right. Can you read that? That's kind of small. You're not going to be able to hear this either. This is the voice of the voiceless. from a band that called themselves Rage Against the Machine. Any fans of them in here? All right, we got little ragers over there. All right, why do you guys like Rage Against the Machine? You grew up with them? All right. Anybody else? Right behind you there, right behind Candace. Why do you like Rage Against the Machine? Didn't you raise your hand? You like him or you just heard of him? No, I like him. All right. All right. So you won't be able to read this. I want to preview one line for you so you can kind of hear it as they sing it. 1991. What's going on in 1991 in this country? Right? Huh? Gulf War, but that's not what this song is about. I mean, it probably is influenced by that, but the specific incident that they're responding to in one of these lyrics and in some of these lyrics is the Rodney King beating. Okay? So you've seen a lot of police brutality captured on videotape and shared via social media in the last few years, via the Black Lives Movement, which is a very powerful force of social protest in this country right now. Social media is a very powerful form of social protest, just sharing things, right? In this case, Rodney King was one of the most notorious beatings, police brutality beatings that ever happened in this country. How many of you have ever seen that video? Maybe in a history class for you guys. If you've ever seen Spike Lee's film, I think it's Malcolm X, where he put that at the end of the movie as well. I could be wrong, but it's one of the Spike Lee films. But what he's saying about little brother, so if you know the George Orwell idea of Big Brother, is that in this dystopian future of 1984, George Orwell's novel, there is this idea that everywhere you go, there will be cameras. There will be no privacy. Everything that you say and think will be monitored by the government. And it's really scary, right? You can't have any freedom of thought, no freedom of expression, right? So like many social protest writers, Rage Against the Machine here, they are dealing in the context of thinking about themselves in the history of other people. And they mention Orwell specifically. And Orwell's hell, a terror era coming through. But this little brother is watching you too. The little brother is your camera. Back then, a video camera. Today, your phone. Right? The little brother is this metaphor, is that in terms of social protest, in terms of making real, making visual what's being done by power to the people, we now have these little devices in our hands. Without those, then the Rodney King beating would have never been seen by people. So whoever recorded that is what they're talking about here as we rage against the machine. This one's kind of hard to hear because they're raging.
My panther, my brother, we are at war until you're free. None of us silence the voice. None of voiceless. None of us silence the voice. None of voiceless. None of us silence the voice. None of voiceless. None of us silence the voice. None of voiceless. In Orwell's hell, terror era coming through, but this little brother watching you too. In Orwell's hell, a terror era coming through, but this little brother's watching you too, watching you too.
What's my panther? My panther, my brother. What is that a reference to? The Black Panther Party, right? So, and this is a gesture of solidarity, right? I am not going to be. We are at war until you're free. Until this war against black people in this country is over, we are at war, right? This is 91. You got the Black Eyed Peas in 2003. If you look at the imagery in their video, a lot of the same imagery is going on there. Black people being accosted by cops for no reason. So long before there was Black Lives Matter, there was the whole history of African American literature and expressive poetics is filled with this rage against that particular machine of the way that African Americans are criminalized in space all the time by police departments. Right? So artists give voice to that, in solidarity in this case, from direct experience in other cases. But I love that there's a band called Rage Against the Machine. So I'm going to put together some strange people on this slide because I like to do that. Karl Marx, you might have heard of him. He said that internationals of the world should unite. International workers of the world unite. He wrote that in the middle of the 19th century. Right? This was a call for the vast majority of people in the world who are workers, who do all of the labor, while the very few collect the benefits, to see more together in their class interest than in their national interest. It hasn't worked for the most part, right? So early labor movements tried very hard to foster an international workers' identity, but mostly I think the 20th century saw people fall into nationalism. Even in countries that became communistic, they were nationalistic countries in those places. The movement didn't spread to sort of like the class identity of workers throughout the world. It's more like Chinese workers and French workers and American workers and so on and so forth. And so we're so often pitted against each other in war that seemed to be natural, right? So I personally see one of the great battles, great ideological battles in life is between a class notion of identity and a national notion of identity. Right? How do we see ourselves? Do we see ourselves as workers? And I think in the 21st century as consumers. How do we consume? Jason Mark is going to speak with you guys about that in a couple of weeks. He's a brilliant speaker on sustainability and our role as consumers. That's one thing you could say consumers of the world unite now. Because if we don't buy, they can't do. If we don't work, they can't make. They can't earn, right? So, but there's a lot of labor law right now. I probably just broke some of it. So anyway, then this claim from Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson, We Are the World. You guys know that video? We Are the World from the 1980s, right? I'm not going to play that one. Everybody knows that one, right? But that's a claim of internationality, isn't it? Right? When there's suffering and poverty and starvation going on in one place, even if it's not in your home, it's our world, right? We should donate to take care of that. Martin Luther King was told by many people when he was organizing civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance in areas, say Birmingham, where he went to jail, get out of here, you're not wanted here, you don't live here, you don't belong here, you're an outsider, you're an outside agitator. Right? What King answered was that I'm here because injustice is here. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Very powerful statement. I don't think there's a better writer in the English language than Martin Luther King. Really, that letter from Birmingham jail is one of the most powerful things you'll ever read. If you haven't read that, make it a point to get a copy of that and enjoy that one. Mr. President Reagan is really mad that I put him on this list with everybody else, right? Because he doesn't really belong. Like, what's he doing here, right? But the reason that I put Reagan on here, when he said very famously, tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev, right? You guys have all heard that. I was like, what business does he have telling somebody over there in Europe and Russia to do anything, right? Of course, right? He's doing the same thing Martin Luther King is doing. He's saying, I'm concerned about the wall in Berlin. I'm concerned about injustice over there, even though I live here, right? So in some cases, we're like, hey, Reagan said tear down that wall, and Gorbachev did, right? But then in other times, we put Martin Luther King in jail because he's over in Birmingham, and he's actually his hometown is Atlanta, right? So sometimes that will be marshaled against you if you are protesting that you don't belong there. And part of the goal of protest is to say, no, we are common. We are not Americans, we are workers, international consumers, international women, international human beings, right? And our concerns are common, and we're not going to let these petty divisions imposed by the machine of politics and nationalism and hatred divide us from our sense of human rights and justice, right? You get that? Right? See that? That's a rhetorical strategy that works, right? It's very powerful to work. One of my favorite writers is a guy by the name of William Morris. He was writing in the middle of the 19th century. And I like this quote because you might think that the problem between Europeans and the Middle East is a new problem. But look at this quote from 1884. And William Morris, who called himself the first English Marxist and was a strong proponent of the arts and crafts movement, he's considered to be the founder of that movement in Britain in the 1860s, wrote in an essay, I won't submit to be dressed up in red and marched off to shoot at my French or German or Arab friend in a quarrel that I don't understand. I will rebel sooner than do that. It's a great quote, right? But 1880s, you might not be surprised to see the French or the German there, but to think that William Morris was aware that British soldiers were being sent to fight Arabs back then was also something that he was refusing it, What he's saying is that, no, those are my friends. Don't confuse, you big shots who are fighting over like whatever resources you want to mine out of this planet, don't get me in your war. Work it out. Go to a room someplace and work that out. I'm not going to go fight. What if every single working class person in the world said no to those fights? No more fights, no more wars. I think I got one more here. Truth is a powerful weapon. This is my favorite speaker today, Aung San Suu Kyi, who is I call her a Burmese leader because that's how she likes to refer to herself. Her country is known today as Myanmar. And for many, many years, for more than 2 decades, she was under house arrest. She was democratically elected as the leader of her people, but the military people who ruled the country did not allow her to seat after that election, and they kept her under house arrest for more than 2 decades. And she wrote during the time of that incarceration, so both she and Martin Luther King are writing from the place of incarceration, a letter from Birmingham jail, or in this case, her own house. She couldn't leave the house, but she was at least in a house, not a jail. She says, truth is a powerful weapon. People may not think so, but it is very powerful. And truth, like anything that is powerful, can be frightening or assuring, depending on what side you are on. If you are on the side of truth, it is very reassuring. You have its protection. But if you are on the side of untruth, then it's very frightening. Voice of hope. I'm going to skip over this slide, but if you want to play it yourself, this is her. She got the Nobel Prize for Peace. She finally got to accept it almost 2 decades after she was awarded it. She finally got out of house arrest and she went to Norway to pick it up. I'm not going to get through more than half of these slides, but that's the way it usually goes. And I think I want to do my boy John here. John Denver is a singer that I grew up on and love. Any fans of John Denver in here? That would be your grandparents, maybe. You like John Denver? I love you. What's your name? I love that guy. Sorry, I didn't hear you. What John Denver songs do you know? That's all right. I don't want to put you on the spot, right? So John Denver is noted for a couple of songs that were really big radio hits. He made a lot of money in the 70s. But for most of his career, his real work was in doing protest music and in nature music. He's one of the great nature singers of our times, and he passed in 1997. This video that he put together is asking the questions, why are we making weapons rather than feeding our babies? And I think I'm going to end up ending on this one today because we're just going to run out of time. But it's a very powerful one, and he showed this in Japan at an International Earth Day festival, and he talks about it himself as he introduces it here, and I'll let him talk about it. So the sad thing is not too many people saw that video. I myself didn't see it for years after I knew that song. I'm going to skip over a couple of these quotes from the Romantic poets here. This PowerPoint, as I've mentioned, is on Moodle if you want to look at some of these things more at length. But I just want to talk about that. The other context for that particular song is what was called the farm crisis in the United States in the Midwest. Some of you who may have been raised on farms or worked on farms in your childhood here in California know that still today your way of life is under fire by huge conglomerates of agricultural businesses that are just much more efficient than family farmers can compete with, right? So family farms in the 80s were going under, and partly what Denver did in that song was he put himself in the voice of one of those farmers who was losing his land. And then he put himself in the voice of a Soviet general whose son had died in a war and who had lived through the World War II fight against Hitler's Germany, right? So part of what he's doing there is an empathetic move towards trying to get into other people's experiences. The last part of the song is himself, a very romantic poet kind of voice, which is saying, if peace is our vision, let us begin. We have to end with that hope. Let's talk about what's happening, but let's end with that hope. Now, I bet that for most of you, you never heard this particular song. You might have heard Thank God I'm a Country Boy, or you might have heard Calypso, which is about the great environmentalist Jacques Cousteau, or Rocky Mountain High, if you've ever seen the horror movie Final Destination. They make fun of that song. No Final Destination fans in here? I'm going to stop making that reference. Seriously? Nobody watches Final Destination? No? All right. It's only like, what are there, like 6 of those? Anyway, the point I want to say is that Denver's message here is not new. Even President Eisenhower, who led the Allied campaign in the 40s against Germany, said, on the death of Stalin, he said, we've got to stop building up our armaments. You probably heard already in the first day of class about his farewell warning, his warning to the United States about the military-industrial complex. Here's the thing. General Electric is one of the biggest corporations that makes weapons in our country. General Electric bought the label that John Denver recorded on, RCA. After that particular song, RCA dropped John Denver, who had made them millions of dollars, from their label. Was that because he wasn't selling anymore, wasn't being marketed anymore, or were his messages getting too politically urgent? That's just a pitch for something I hope you heard about, is watch the conglomeration of power in the hands of the few in this country, right? When the munitions maker, General Electric, buys your entertainment sector and then gets to censor who's telling the stories and singing the songs, that's a deep problem. And it's something that we've been very concerned about over the last few years, few decades, really. So on the rest of that PowerPoint, I'll just highlight a couple of things that I'm not going to get to today. I always show Woody Guthrie's song, This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land. The video, the clip that's on the Moodle PowerPoint is fantastic. You should listen to Woody Guthrie. He has a great voice for the people. And if you think that song is just a little patriotic ditty, Woody will tell you what it really is about. It's not about that. And I also have some hopeful poetry from Denise Levertov on making peace, and a song by the Indigo Girl called Shine My Life Like a Light, which is one of my last things I'd like to say to you guys is be that vision of peace, be that vision of social justice, shine your life like lights. And I have 5 minutes for questions. Or comments, or social protest music that you guys like. I didn't do any of the art either, so there's a lot of art on those slides as well. But if you want, there's art you can look at. That's a good one. Picasso's Guernica. Candace wants to ask a question. I think that artists will always find a way to subvert any form that is forced upon them. So, in fact, I didn't get to it. I promised it, I didn't get to it. But The Bug's Life, when the ants kind of rise up at the end, and they're like, no, you're afraid of us, and we are many, and you are one, and they chase the grasshoppers away, right? That's a Disney movie. So I think you can do I think Disney movies have been great at social protest over the last few years in terms of really subverting gender paradigms. So her question was, do I think that we're having more or less social protest now? I think in some ways independent media, independent music is really powerful voices of protest. I think sometimes we're also inundated with mass culture and with blockbusters and with reality television that we're maybe not paying attention to those smaller voices, but I still think they're out there and I think they're being heard. So if you listen to KPFA, you'll hear some of those voices that are doing music that is rooted in the streets. I think Janelle Monáe, who I showed last year, and Erykah Badu, there are some great singers and songwriters. The Coup have always been like that. So if you like hip hop music, there's a lot of great social protest that comes not so much about the flash and stuff, but more about the urgency of social problems. But I think artists will always find a way to subvert a form and be. I was watching an episode of Battlestar Galactica once, and that speech from Mario Savio was repeated in the episode of Battlestar Galactica that I was watching. I was like, that's cool. Right? I think Battlestar Galactica is a very, very cool way to use social criticism through science fiction media. Any Battlestar Galactica fans in here? That was Chief. You remember Chief doing that speech? All right. Yeah. Any other questions? Chingling, you have any questions or things you want to add in? No, it's all right. All right.
What do you think about the notion of violent versus non-violent protests? Is just sharing things
Okay, so I'm going to just resist the opposition. What was your opposition? Was violence versus nonviolence?
Yeah.
I think what you're really asking me about is active versus passive, right? And I'm in favor of active. I'm in favor of active nonviolence. And I think that peace and protest and songs are some of the ways that we mobilize those kinds of movements. I personally believe, I don't think you heard this lecture this year, but I've seen Dr. Cynthia Boas from the Political Science Department. She's convinced me that historically nonviolent movements are more effective than violent movements, just in sort of getting change to happen. And I kind of fundamentally lean that way myself. But I think those movements need things like Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which gets printed all across America and which rouses indignity. And then people have to move their bodies and put their bodies into those places. But I prefer nonviolence in terms of what I think is more effective, but not passive, not just clicking share, share, share. I do think you need to get involved. But sharing and informing each other on social media is a way to share. Find that video of John Denver and share it with people, you know, if you like it, or pull all these things off of my PowerPoint slide. Right? The more you share those words, people have been protesting oppressive structures of power in the tradition that I study since the Romantic period. And I'm sure well before then, too. I love that question. Thank you, Eric. I think that's time.